Well, this video aged about as well as a bunch of bananas being left to rot in the open sun. For this to make sense though, I'll need to give context. This video is about the 2015 IndyCar season for the Dale Coyne Racing team. It was, unfortunately, a pretty awful year with an inconsistent driver lineup, accidents, low finishing positions, and just a general lack of performance. I therefore posed the question of whether this was the worst IndyCar season for a team. When I posted that on the last day of last year, or maybe it came out on New Year's Day for any Australians and New Zealand people watching this, I was fairly confident that at least in the 21st century, there hadn't been a worse season, or that it would be quite a while for anything to rival it. I certainly didn't expect for it to be challenged the very next season. And, sadly, it's the same team that has potentially outdone themselves in the completely wrong way. Dale Coyne Racing is one of, if not the, smallest team in IndyCar. Yet with that being said, prior to this year, their performances were pretty impressive. Grosjean did wonders for the team in his first IndyCar season for them, and David Malukas put in some fantastic drives for the team, particularly on the ovals, enough to grab the attention of bigger teams. And indeed David would end up signing for McLaren for 2024. Albeit he'd never actually end up racing for them due to a mountain bike accident. The team's second car last year was driven by Stingray Rob, a person with a name so cool it can never be overstated, even though I'm sure some of you watching this are getting fed up at how many times it's being mentioned. The 2020 Indy Pro 2000 champion though was heading over to AJ Foyt Racing for 2024. And it doesn't take someone with an MPhil in Pythagoras theorem to work out that, with those two drivers leaving, it meant 2 seats for the 2024 season were up for grabs. And this is where things start to go a bit awry. So, after the 2023 season concluded, Formula 2 driver Enzo Fittipaldi tested for Dale Coyne at Sebring in November of that year. A move that perhaps made sense. For whatever reason though, Enzo would end up doing another season of F2 rather than move to IndyCar. Indy Next frontrunner Jacob Abel also tested for them post-season, but was committed to another year in the category for 2024. Coyne though were in a unique position with apparently several drivers desperate to get either one of the 2 open seats available, potentially even including F1 reserve drivers and other F2 racers. Coyne himself said, "We're talking to all the usual suspects, and there's some surprises. Those guys really want to be in Formula 1 so bad, but you just can't go every weekend and sit there and eat quiche because you're a reserve driver. That's a nice lifestyle, but a true racer doesn't really want to do that forever." That being said though, Dale was willing to take his time in finding his lineup. One candidate to emerge was another Indy Next racer in Singaporean Daniel Frost. And it too did make sense. He signed a development contract with the team, tested for the team in October 2022, and apparently demonstrated himself to be a competent person behind the wheel. However, those plans had to be put on hold for a very unusual reason. He would be a part of the Singaporean army, which is compulsory, and he'd be in that role for 2 years, effectively meaning that his racing career is currently at a standstill, and he was now out of the question for Coyne. Former Andretti IndyCar racer Devlin DiFrancesco was also rumoured to be in with a shout, but never ended up in the seat. By the middle of January of this year, every other seat on the grid had been filled. The season opener though was still a couple of months away, so plenty of time to get a driver pairing lined up. 3 days before practice would commence at the season opener, we finally had some news on the driver front. In the 18 car, British driver Jack Harvey would get a chance at trying to rekindle the promise he showed when he was driving for Meyer Shank Racing, after a 2-year stint to forget at Rahal Letterman Lanigan. However, he wouldn't be doing the full season. Instead, he was scheduled to do 14 of the 18 events, the other 4 being driven by another Indy Next racer and a regular in sports car racing, Nolan Siegel. Siegel showed fantastic speed in the first portion of last year's Indy Next season, but his performances did tail off in the second half of the season on his way to finishing 3rd in the championship. He was doing another season of Indy Next, but could do 4 IndyCar races this year and still be classed as a rookie in 2025, where a full season was on the cards. Both Harvey and Siegel had tested for Coyne in 2024 and showed decent speed, so perhaps not a massive shock that they would race with the team in some degree. But already, when you take into account the very late announcement, and that 2 different drivers would be in the seat over the course of the year, it's not exactly ideal. But if you thought that was far from optimal, its second entry appeared to be in an even more precarious state. The 51 car, which was run in a partnership with NASCAR Cup Series outfit, Rick Ware Racing, had only got a driver confirmed for the first race and the non-championship event at the Thermal Club. It was, though, a very pleasant surprise as to who the driver was. A unique IndyCar rookie at 35 years old, but a brilliant one in Colin Braun. Colin had competed in NASCAR's Rallycross and had plenty of recent success in sports car racing, particularly in prototypes. Despite his adaptability though, his single-seater experience was very limited, he'd only driven the car for one test day earlier in the year, and he brought next to no funding for the programme. He was recommended by Dale's team manager Mitch Davis to see how he'd fare, and clearly had talent, even setting comparable times to Harvey during testing. But for Colin, he was getting thrown at the deepest end he'd ever been to. Making your IndyCar debut in an ultra-competitive series, a smaller team, and on a demanding street circuit, which out of everything he's done in his career is probably the circuit type he's least used to. It's a bit like a fisherman who's able to catch fish in a small lake with relative ease, being asked to immediately become a trawlerman. Yes, you're still catching fish, but it far from guarantees that you'll be good at it. Here's what Dale had to say. I think we have a great combination of drivers that will work well together, as they've shown at our tests in Homestead and Sebring. Jack brings a lot of experience to the team, and he immediately fit right in when he tested with us. Nolan, like Jack, is a pleasure to work with. We already know what Colin Braun can do in a sports car, and it was great to see him jump into our IndyCar last week. Qualifying for the race in St. Petersburg wasn't great. Colin set the slowest lap of all the drivers, 7/10 off the next slowest time. A time set by Jack Harvey, but he was much closer with the main pack. However, due to the unique way in which qualifying works for the IndyCar series, Colin would start in 25th, with Harvey last in 27th. I could explain why this is the case, but it would take me a long time, so I won't. In a race where field strategy would play a major factor, passing was pretty limited, and the Dale Coyne drivers would make minimal ground in the early stages. Then things started to get gradually worse for Colin. During a pit stop, fuel would ignite and he would drive down pit road with a section of his car on fire. Colin carried on, but just after the halfway mark, Colin locked up at turn 10 and went up the escape road. Again, he would keep going without damage, but was now a lap down, and from that point, he wasn't able to recover. He'd end up being classified in 20th, whilst Jack Harvey had a fairly uneventful event, finishing in 17th. The next event was a non-championship race at the Thermal Club, along with about 40 trillion hours of practice. If you're Colin Braun though, it's all the merrier, as it allows him more practice, along with being on a more conventional circuit. That should suit him better. It was also going to be good for Nolan Siegel, who was entering the first of his 4 planned race events in the 18 car, and was also in desperate need of track time. Qualifying wasn't brilliant once again, with both Siegel and Braun earning the 12th fastest times in their respective heat grids. In Nolan's heat, utter bedlam at the start meant that he climbed to 7th. A great start by anyone's books. And he was right on the back of Colton Herta at the end of the heat, looking for 6th place. But he couldn't quite get the position. Which was a pity as well, because to get a place in the final, you needed to finish 6th or better out of your heat. Anyone outside the top 6 were eliminated. So good drive or not, it wasn't to be for Nolan. For Colin, he didn't have anywhere near as much chaos to try and make the most of. In fact, the only off-track moment that occurred involved himself, going wide on the exit of turn 6. Whether that was self-induced or from getting pushed off by another car, it made his rather slim chance of making the final become even slimmer. Braun finished last in his heat, and thus rounded off what was originally announced for his schedule in the 51 car. Unfortunately, despite the fanfare that was made when he was announced, and for very good reason it must be said, his 2 scheduled races weren't anything to shout home about. And as it turned out, this would be the last we'd see of Colin Braun in an IndyCar this season. Racing is a cutthroat business, and when you don't have the best of outings, along with bringing next to no budget to the programme, then the guillotine is particularly sharp for those people in that scenario. A shame, because he clearly has talent, but it just didn't show in an IndyCar. So, who would drive the 51 at Long Beach? Well, Siegel was scheduled to race the 18 car, but he would end up moving over to the 51 car instead. So the 18 was now open, and that would go to Jack Harvey, a race that he hadn't planned on competing in, but ended up doing so anyway. In qualifying, Nolan Siegel would set a slightly faster time than Harvey, but once again due to the funny way qualifying works, Harvey would start 23rd, while Siegel would start 27th and last. Siegel would have a trouble-free race and end up 20th. Trouble-free is not what Jack Harvey would have. Albeit, to be fair to him, there was nothing he could do in trying to avoid the out-of-control Christian Rasmussen. The damage would impact Harvey's speed and also put him a couple of laps down at race's end. 25th would be his finishing position. Nolan Siegel was now heading back to Indy next, so therefore there was once again an open seat available alongside Jack Harvey for the round at Barber Motorsports Park. However, as it turned out, not even the team themselves knew who would be in the 51 car when the Long Beach weekend was done. A driver, though, was found, and that person was Italian former Formula 2 and Williams F1 test and reserve driver, Luca Ghiotto. Now, if anyone had predicted that we would end up seeing this guy competing for the team this season, then they must know a lot of things, such as what the Da Vinci Code is, what the area of a circle is without a calculator, and of course, how to get the perfect taste from a cauliflower. I will clarify that the surprise of seeing Luca in the seat isn't meant to be a dig at his ability. He was a very decent F2 runner, but had been out of single-seaters on a regular basis for a few years now, so it was still going to be challenging. Oh, and he had never driven an Indycar before, and it was going to be on one of the most physically demanding circuits on the calendar too. Ghiotto said, "I've spent the majority of my career overseas, but was always intrigued and wanting to try Indycar. It will be my first time driving this car, and my first time at this track, so there's a steep learning curve and challenge ahead of me, but I'm very much looking forward to it." Sure enough, Luca was a fair way off in practice, but he continued to make steady progress throughout, until qualifying, where he put in a frankly brilliant performance. Okay, qualifying 21st place doesn't read too well on the surface, I know that, but look a little more in depth, and you'll see that not only did he qualify faster than Jack Harvey, but in the group qualifying session, he set the 17th fastest time. Having never driven the car before, that is undoubtedly impressive. Jack Harvey would start 22nd, but would stay in that position for all of about one straight, as entering turn 1, he got collected and spun round. He did recover pretty well though, even managing to pass Ghiotto after 5 laps on the same tyre, who I imagine was just trying to bed himself in somewhat. An alternative pit strategy for Harvey meant that for the latter stages of the race, he'd be in the top 10. In the end, the strategy worked out pretty well, as Harvey would end up finishing in 13th. For Luca, his aim was probably to get to the end without crashing, which he achieved, albeit this sketchy moment would have surely spiked his heart rate on his way to a 21st place finish. Next up, the Indy GP, where Jack Harvey and Luca Ghiotto would return, in what was Ghiotto's last confirmed outing for the team. Like usual, the field was super close in qualifying, and for the Dale Coyne drivers, it was 17th for Jack Harvey and 22nd for Luca Ghiotto. It was a fairly dull race for Jack on his way to 18th, but in a race with just one caution, it was thrown for a certain Italian, which, given there was only one competing, kind of limits our options as to who it was. Luca Ghiotto would lose the rear end and lose the engine at the same time too, stalling the car. He'd lose a lap and finish 25th, in what could have been his last IndyCar start. Whether it was or not, we'll just have to see. But up next was the big one, the 108th running of the Indianapolis 500. Now, there was some good news to start off the team's month of May. The drivers for both cars had already been assigned. Nolan Siegel in the 18 car, and in the 51 car, it was confirmed in early April that British driver Catherine Legg would attempt to make a second consecutive start at the Indy 500, having driven a 4th rail entry in 2023. That, though, is where the good news kinda stopped, because the more laps in practice that were being completed, the more of an indication we got that both Dale Coyne run entries were towards the bottom on speed, and could be in the running for the dreaded bump day, where one driver of the 34 entries would be going home. But on Fast Friday, the task of qualifying will get a whole lot tougher for Siegel. On a mock qualifying run, Siegel lost the rear end coming out of turn 2, hitting the wall before getting airborne and then violently pile-driving the tarmac back to earth again on his left-hand side pod, until finally the car came to a halt on the backstretch. Thankfully, Nolan got out of the accident unharmed, and even sounded remarkably calm despite being upside down. The car, though, wasn't so fortunate, with a backup chassis needing to be utilised, as you can perhaps tell, because it was now sporting a livery similar to Jack Harvey's. Usually the backup car isn't as fast as the primary chassis, and when your primary chassis wasn't great to begin with, alarm bells will be ringing with dramatic intensity. On the first qualifying day, Siegel was the slowest entry, and despite her best efforts, even clipping the wall on one of her runs, both the Dale Coyne entries would be part of the bump day proceedings. Catherine Legg set a 4-lap average of 230.092 miles per hour, which would put her into the contest, despite having what looked like a fairly nervous race car. Siegel meanwhile set a 229.566 miles per hour 4-lap average, which wasn't a million miles away, but was possibly going to be the slowest of the 4 bump day entries. Until Marcus Ericsson of Andretti Global got the amount of laps wrong on his initial 4-lap attempt, meaning he was the car at risk of going home. Later on though, Marcus did complete a run and guaranteed his passage into the race, dropping Nolan Siegel out, and there would only be time for one run. Siegel needed to beat a 4-lap average of 229.974 set by Graham Rahal. At turn 1 on his second lap, Nolan hit the wall, breaking his toe link, before spinning out of control and into the wall, and out of the greatest spectacle in racing. Again, Siegel thankfully emerged unscathed from the accident, not that this seemed to matter to him. I'm fine, but I don't really care if I'm fine at this point. That's somewhat irrelevant. We're going home because we did everything we could, and I think we can be very proud of that. I wasn't going to go home without lifting. It was the last run in qualifying, and I was going to go flat. And I went flat. Racing drivers are a different breed, aren't they? But that being said, the Dale Coyne team did still have one car in the race. So, let's see how Catherine got on. After staying out of early trouble, Catherine's race was cut short prematurely, with an engine issue on lap 22, and would be classified in 29th place. It sadly continued a miserable run at this race, having not gotten higher than 22nd in her 4 starts. So far, things were looking pretty bleak for the Dale Coyne team, and what's more, is the team still didn't have a confirmed driver in the 51 entry for the next round on the tight and bumpy streets of Detroit. Jack Harvey would return to the 18 as scheduled, but with 1 week away from the next race, the clock was ticking. Wait, hold on, why are we fading the screen to black? Through the despair, the pain, the desolation, and the embers of broken dreams, you're down, but not out, because you know, when needed, you can call upon your secret trump card with a simple phone call. They go by the name of Le Sauveur de Dale Coyne Racing, but is actually known as Tristan Vautier, the saviour of Dale Coyne Racing, is back! Magnifique! It may have been nearly 7 years since Tristan was in an Indycar, but who cares? Dale always has the 2012 Indy Lights champion on standby as he carries Tristan's race seat in one of the haulers, just in case he's required. Here's what the great man had to say. Dale has his famous saying, "You never know," and this opportunity to race again in Indycar with him is exactly like his saying. I've had a lot of opportunities like this that put me back on the map, so that is what I'm hoping for. I'm not scared of doing this with no preparation, but to be fully honest and humble, I certainly don't underestimate the challenge. But as challenges go, nothing is too daunting for the almighty Vautier. In qualifying, both the Dale Coyne entries were the slowest of the entire field. Harvey's had a slightly faster time than Vautier, but yet again with how qualifying works, Vautier would start ahead of Harvey in 25th and 27th respectively. At the start, a pileup would involve a number of cars, and the Coyne drivers would get stuck in the mess. An unsecured wheel on a pit stop would send Tristan Vautier back to the pits, and then drop him down a lap. But thanks to further chaos and rain, he not only got his lap back, but climbed to as high as 8th place. All within half race distance. But what also occurred within half race distance was Colton Herta nearly taking out the almighty Vautier. However, with reflexes even a cat would be jealous of, Tristan ducked out of the way just in time. He would though tumble back down the order once again. More chaos would put Harvey briefly in a top 10 position, before he and several other drivers went down pit road under a caution. One of the drivers who didn't was Tristan Vautier, and he somehow, in some way, managed to get into 3rd position with 30 laps of this contest remaining. Although, should we be surprised? I mean, this is the almighty Tristan Vautier after all. However, no matter how incredible he is, there's one thing that he, and indeed any other driver, can't do, and that is defy physics. On what was potentially his last stint, Tristan was on the softer green sidewall tyre, and with the latter portion of the race being caution-free, there's no way the tyres would last, and he would gradually tumble down the order despite some very valiant defending. With 4 laps left, he had to pit, and would drop to 18th position, which is where he would finish, a lap down. 1 place behind Jack Harvey. A dispiriting end to what was actually a really good drive. Oh, and by the way, you know how I said earlier that Vautier's seat was always in at least one of Dale Coyne's haulers? Well, for the one time it was necessary, it wasn't in one of them, so another one had to be made for him. I mean, this story just keeps adding layers as we go along. Vautier's gig was only for Detroit, as he couldn't do the next round at Road America because he was Cadillac's reserve driver at Le Mans, so someone else would get the 51 car. At least this time, it was a familiar face, as Luca Ghiotto would be back for not just Elkhart Lake, but for the round after that at Laguna Seca. Some driver consistency, maybe soon, fingers crossed. Luca did a fairly decent job in his first 2 races, spin at Indy aside, and with his 2 scheduled races coming on fast, flowing European-style circuits, he might be able to do a bit better with more experience under his belt. Not that any of this could have prepared him for qualifying though. Now, he would be driving an Indycar in the wet. Unsurprisingly perhaps, Luca was towards the back. 23rd place for him, whilst Harvey was 20th. At the start, chaos reigned at the front, but there was some mostly off-camera antics at the back that also occurred, with Graham Rahal spinning at turn 1. And as you can tell by this still frame, he got in contact from Luca Ghiotto. This therefore gave the Italian a drive-through penalty. And whilst he did have decent speed, it wasn't enough to get any higher than 22nd, just remaining on the lead lap. For Harvey, he did make decent progress up the order, but this was all pretty much in vain, as on lap 38 he had a front suspension issue which needed some repairs, and meant he lost 4 laps. 25th is where he ended up. Hopefully things would improve at Laguna Seca. Qualifying results: Jack Harvey 26th, Luca Ghiotto 27th. Also sadly known as the bottom of the grid. Both drivers made a bit of progress at the start, but then any hard work that had been done from Luca's perspective was quickly over, as on lap 35 he went wide at turn 4 and hit the wall, causing heavy damage to the 51 machine, and thus sending him out of the race. Jack Harvey managed to get comfortably in the top 20, but on lap 82 an engine issue would force him out of the race as well, finishing in 25th. Look, I'm trying to be as positive as I can, but there's no getting away from the fact that so far, this has been an utterly awful season for the team. After 8 rounds and 1 non-championship event, between the 2 entries, there had been 1 top 15 finish. But even so, maybe, just maybe, things would get a bit better at the next round in mid-Ohio. Albeit, Luca Ghiotto wasn't back in the 51 machine. In his place, it is the one and only Sowery. No, the almighty Tristan Vautier wasn't back, but instead, for a planned one-off, British driver Toby Sowery would be making his IndyCar debut. He had an extensive resume in the Indy Next series, but had gone into sports car racing before getting an opportunity with the 51 car. It did seem though to be a very daunting challenge for him. He had driven an IndyCar just once in a test for the Rahal Letterman Lanigan team, and he was having to get to grips with the new hybrid system that was being debuted at this race. So, how would the British pairing fare? Well, in qualifying, for Harvey, he would end up last, and Sowery in 25th, but with a much slower time than Harvey. Although, you shouldn't read a whole lot into that, because an energy recovery system issue meant that Sowery only had time for 1 lap. For Harvey, his race was a nightmare. He ended up last of the finishers a lap down, thanks to stalling after his first pit stop. But that doesn't explain the whole story. Yet, we'll come on to that later. Sowery had a race that was mostly off camera, unfortunately, but the scoring pylon wasn't making up stuff. And in a caution-free race, it showed him getting further and further up the order. Whilst he was overtaken by Romain Grosjean, a spin by the Juncos Hollinger racing driver would promote Toby to 13th again, and that is where he stayed. The race wasn't very exciting, but he made the most on-track passes of all the drivers. Ultimately, for someone making their debut having never driven with the hybrid before, and with one of the sport's smaller teams, to get 13th place on pure pace alone is a phenomenal result. Not to mention that it was the team's joint best finish of the season so far. Toby said, "It's a completely new chapter and a new learning experience for me. So to come away with 13th and fighting the big teams on merit, not a lucky situation or on strategy, just pure pace and good calls from the team, I'm super happy. All I can say is, let's just hope that this guy gets another opportunity. If there was to be another opportunity, it wasn't going to be at the Iowa doubleheader, because whilst it was only confirmed on the week before the weekend, it was rumoured for a fair while that Catherine Legg would do the remaining oval events in the 51 car alongside the 18 car of Jack Harvey. Or at least, that's what was intended. You see, on the Saturday of Mid-Ohio, Jack Harvey woke up in agony. Whilst it's not known how this happened, Jack had severe neck and back spasms coming into qualifying and the race of Mid-Ohio. Whilst he did finish the race, on a track as physical as that and without any yellows, he couldn't give 100% of his natural ability by the end. Harvey said, "Every time I went into turn 1 and turned the car, it was like a knife going into my back. And don't get me wrong, I've had injuries, I've driven with food poisoning and been tired, but normally the adrenaline takes over, and this time, it just didn't." That pain stayed with him at Iowa, and by the time Jack had done a 2-lap qualifying run, every time he got out of the car, he was in complete agony. Whilst I can't find the footage of it, whenever Jack did get out of the car, it was very gingerly, and with a bit of help too. Now, there was a stand-in driver in case Jack couldn't compete, that being seasoned oval racer and regular Indycar stand-in seat filler, Connor Daly. And with Jack still feeling rough, it made sense for Connor to get the drive. Except, he wouldn't for race 1. There was a rule which said that replacement drivers cannot enter a race unless they've done laps beforehand during the weekend. And with Harvey doing practice and qualifying, and no time before the Saturday night race to get a small 10-minute session in for him, Delcoin Racing and Jack Harvey had basically no choice but to at least start the race. Which he did. He dropped the back before the start, which may have been a wise move given several cars wrecked on lap 1, however he couldn't go further than lap 28 before retiring. Daly would end up getting a session before race 2 and would start the race, making him the 8th different Delcoin Racing driver this year so far. However, we've still got to cover how Catherine got on in race 1. Qualifying 26th, Catherine made up ground at the start, but whilst running 16th on a restart, her race would end up getting completely ruined. When will this team catch a break? And this is perhaps quite a unique way in which to have a race be destroyed. Catherine was judged to have gotten out of line too soon on a restart, which results in a drive-through penalty and the loss of at least a lap. The penalty came 46 laps after the incident. Except that incident never happened. She ended up getting a penalty for a rule transgression she didn't do. Her car was mistaken for one of the others, even though it's unknown who that other driver was. It's also worth noting that the livery is somewhat distinctive, which makes the penalty even more bemusing, especially as how the error came about in the first place is currently not known publicly. Despite this being a genuine error in all likelihood, Catherine would end up finishing 17th. The team did receive an apology from Indycar. In race 2, Legg would have a less exciting event, starting 24th, finishing 24th, a few laps down. As a replacement driver, Daly started last, and made up a few positions before retiring on lap 140 with some sort of issue. Not sure 100% what the precise issue was, but Connor did say that he was losing power prior to that moment of retirement. After starting last, Connor would finish last. I mean, at this point, the term "it goes from bad to worse" doesn't even scratch the surface. But Toronto, Jack wasn't scheduled to race the 18 car there, instead being run by Nolan Siegel. However, he was a McLaren IndyCar driver now, so Dale Coyne's team had to find someone else instead. Which they did. Introducing our 9th different driver, last year's Indy Next runner-up, New Zealand's Hunter McElrea. Hunter had tested an IndyCar at Mid-Ohio for Dale's team recently, and clearly impressed enough to be given the call-up for Toronto, even if he once again was being thrown at the deep end on his debut. We still didn't have a driver though for the 51 car, but just a day later, it was confirmed who they would be, and in turn that we would see them at the Portland round as well, and I'm delighted to say that it was Toby Sowery. In practice though, it was Hunter who took the headlines, as in one of the group practice sessions, Hunter was fastest. Just take this image in, everyone. It meant absolutely nothing and the session was heavily interrupted, meaning no truly representative laps were set, but who cares? In the session where lap times count most though, Hunter put it in the wall at the troublesome turn 8. The car wasn't too badly damaged, but not ideal still. He'd start 25th, Sowery 21st. Sowery would make up some places in the opening phase, climbing to 16th. However, after his soft tyres dropped off, he fell down the order, before eventually going down a lap. Hunter made some progress too, but his race would come to a premature conclusion. An off-camera tap of the barrier would lead to a suspension failure, and thus a retirement, on the way to being classified in 24th place. Sowery meanwhile kept going, until he got involved in this monstrous crash involving multiple cars. Everyone was okay, and luckily for him, it was just the front wing that was damaged, and he managed to reverse out and still continue. Toby would finish as the last runner, one lap down, in 15th place, albeit perhaps not a true reflection of the speed he did show once again. Catherine was back for Gateway, but irrespective of her qualifying position, a 9-place engine change penalty put pay to any hopes of a decent starting place. Not that she'd end up setting a qualifying attempt, as her car failed to pass tech. The 18 did leave the pits, but a hybrid issue meant the returning Jack Harvey wouldn't set an attempt either, stopping on the front stretch. In the race, Jack made some progress, but Catherine Legg's event was over before having completed 10 laps, thanks to this crash with Ed Carpenter, thus being classified in last. Harvey meanwhile went on a similar fuel strategy to Scott Dixon, which usually worked tremendously well for the New Zealander, although he is often a miracle worker. However, when even Scott Dixon can't make a fuel strategy work, you know it won't work. Harvey would end up a lap down, but was probably one of the better runners on that strategy. So amazingly, a potential best finish of the season was on the cards. But that wouldn't happen. A bottleneck on a restart caused a number of drivers to crash, and Jack got collected, spinning the Brit into the wall and out of the race, on the way to a 20th place finish. If the team didn't have bad luck, they'd have no luck at all. But surely at some point, their luck would change. This string of misery can't go on forever. And at least Toby Sowery was back at Portland alongside Harvey. In his last start for the team this year, Toby would start 19th on the grid, whilst Harvey would start second from last. And Harvey's race wasn't anything to write home about, finishing 24th, one lap down. Toby would finish a lap down too, but would end up an okay 17th place. But then he did show some fantastic racecraft, once again illustrating his clear talent behind the wheel of an IndyCar. From now on though, Dale Coyne's lineup would be unchanged until season's end. Jack Harvey in the 18, and Catherine Legg in the 51. Amazingly, perhaps the Milwaukee doubleheader is where we'd see the best qualifying performance so far from the team, with Jack Harvey starting race 1 in 14th and race 2 in 13th. It's not brilliant, sure, but it's still an improvement, I guess. Catherine would start 18th in race 1 and 22nd in race 2, although she probably could have done without this spin in the first half of race 1. She kinda got back into the rhythm of things, finishing 19th, 2 laps down. Jack showed some really decent pace, but particularly in the latter stints, started to drop away for whatever reason, ultimately finishing 16th, 1 lap down. In race 2, the fairly high attrition rate did help the Dale Coyne drivers, but once again Jack Harvey showed really good pace, even placing in the top 10 for a time. But despite being on a fresher tyre than some runners, and still being on the lead lap, At around the halfway mark, the pace just seemed to go away again, and Jack would lose a whole load of time, ultimately finishing 14th, 3 laps down. It's still the second highest finishing position of the season, but it felt like there was potential for more. Catherine for a time would lead a few laps, the first time a Dale Coyne car would lead a race for the entire season. Sure, it may have taken until the 16th points paying race of the season, but at least they did lead some laps this season. Ultimately, Catherine would end up 4 laps down in 15th. And with that, we had one last hurrah at Nashville to see where this team could at least end the year with a bit of momentum. For the finale, Jack Harvey would qualify 20th and Catherine Legg 22nd. Catherine's race would end prematurely after hitting the outside wall at turn 4, putting her out of the race before the halfway point. Jack's car didn't really have the pace once again, but pit strategy and a couple of timely caution periods helped him stay just 1 lap down at race's end, finishing in 13th, matching the team's best finish of the season for a 3rd time. With that being said though, that is 1, pretty demoralising to think about, and 2, is rather apt that it should be that number, signifying one of the general themes of their season. A lot of effort, but no luck. The 51 and 18 entries would finish at the bottom of the entrant point standings. Needless to say, this season has been exceptionally difficult for the team. Even in 2015 there are at least some sparks of hope and standout results. 2024 yielded no eye-catching results. For the Dale Coyne fans out there, this year has been almost unbearable at times, which is going to make what I'm about to say all the more bemusing. Dale? Please keep going. Whether the team is doing well or not, they've added a unique storyline to the season. Not knowing who would end up in the seats most rounds was, in a strange way, quite interesting from a fan perspective. And not only that, but it gave drivers an opportunity to prove themselves. Whilst the results weren't there, some demonstrated that they could compete in Indycar. Toby Sowery is a fantastic example. Ordinarily, he'd have never had a chance in Indycar, and Dale did something that he's always done throughout his ownership career, and that's give people, particularly drivers, an opportunity. Toby made a great impression and will hopefully be on the IndyCar grid next season. Dale is a stalwart of IndyCar, someone who seems to put his passion for the sport above financial benefits. I'm not saying he doesn't want to make money, but he'll stay committed to IndyCar despite this season, where the results have been dispiriting and, in all likelihood, he's probably lost money. Dale always finds a way to keep going, with his team being 40 years old now. And IndyCar needs team owners like him. And hopefully next year, things will work out better for them. But with that being said, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. What are your thoughts on Dale Coyne's season, along with your thoughts on the team themselves? Say down in the comment section below. Also, I'd like to apologise for the lack of any uploads recently. I have a few things planned, and hopefully across the coming months you'll notice a few visual changes to the channel, but even so, I'm very sorry for leaving you all in the dark, and I hope this video was worth the wait. If it was, and you'd like to see more content like this, then I'd be enormously appreciative if you did hit the like and subscribe buttons. However, until the next video, be kind to each other, and enjoy the rest of your day.